The first time Zethkar saw humans in combat, he thought he understood them. That was his first mistake. The observation deck of the Coalition cruiser Stellar Harmony hummed with nervous energy as officers from 12 different species watched the tactical displays. Admiral Korvax, a towering Thorillian with midnight blue scales, tapped his clawed fingers against the console in an anxious rhythm that echoed through the bridge. The sound made Zethkar's sensitive hearing twitch, but he kept his 4 eyes focused on the holographic battlefield below. "The human fleet is outnumbered 3-1, whispered Dr. Mitt. Minari, the Altarian xenobiologist whose crystalline features reflected the harsh light of distant explosions. Her voice carried that peculiar harmonic quality that all of her species possessed, making even her worry sound like music. Their ships are smaller, their technology inferior. This is madness." Zethkar adjusted the viewing angle with a thought, his neural interface responding to the slightest mental command. As an intelligence officer specializing in alien combat psychology, he had studied dozens of species and their approaches to warfare. The Kytherian hive mind fought with perfect coordination but lacked individual initiative. The Vreks used overwhelming firepower to compensate for their naturally peaceful nature. The Zephyrians relied on speed and guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows of asteroid fields and nebulae. But humans? Humans were different. They fought like they were already dead. "Look at their formation," Zethkar observed, his translator converting his whistling native language into standard Galactic. "They're not trying to win. They're trying to hold the line." On the display, the human fleet had arranged itself into a defensive wall between the approaching Devourers and the evacuating civilian ships. The Devourers were exactly what their name suggested, a biomechanical horror that consumed everything in their path, converting matter into more of themselves. They had appeared at the edge of human space 3 days ago, emerging from the dark void between galaxies like a plague made manifest. Every other species had one response to the Devourers: run. Run fast, run far, and hope they chose a different direction. But the humans had done something unprecedented. They had turned around and attacked. "Incoming transmission from the human flagship," announced Lieutenant Vex, a young Saurian whose green scales still held the bright coloration of inexperience. "Admiral Chen requests permission to speak to the Coalition observation team." Admiral Korvax's scales darkened, a sign of deep concern among his people. On screen, the holographic display shifted to show the bridge of the human vessel Indomitable. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the camera, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a military bun, her uniform bearing the scars of hasty repairs. Behind her, Zethkar could see human crew members working with calm efficiency despite the chaos of battle raging outside their hull. What struck him most was their faces. No panic, no fear of death, but something else entirely, something that made his 4 stomachs churn with unease. "Admiral Korvax," Chen began, her voice steady despite the ship shaking from nearby impacts, "I want to thank you for responding to our request for evacuation assistance. The civilian vessels are almost clear of the system." "Admiral Chen," Korvax replied, his translator struggling with the Thorillian formal honorifics. "Your fleet is heavily outmatched. We can provide covering fire while you withdraw with the civilians." Chen's expression didn't change, but Zethkar caught something flicker across her features. Not fear, not anger, but something that made his skin crawl despite his thick environmental suit. "Negative, Admiral. We're not withdrawing." "Admiral, please reconsider. Your sacrifice will accomplish nothing. The Devourers will simply follow the civilian ships to their next destination." "No," Chen said quietly, and her voice carried a certainty that chilled every observer on the Coalition bridge. "They won't." The transmission cut, and the humans resumed their impossible fight. Zethkar watched in fascination and growing horror as human ships threw themselves against the Devourer's swarm with suicidal determination. They weren't fighting to win. They weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting to buy time, and they were willing to pay any price for it. "By the eternal void," whispered Dr. Minari. "What are they doing?" Zethkar's enhanced vision allowed him to see details that escaped the others. Human ships that should have retreated when their hulls breached instead increased speed, ramming themselves into Devourer vessels. Escape pods that should have been launching were being jettisoned empty while their crews remained at their stations. And through it all, the human communication channels carried no screams, no pleas for help, no last messages home. They carried work orders, tactical updates, calm professional reports, as if this were just another day at the office. "They're buying time," Zethkar realized, his voice barely above a whisper. "But for what? The civilians are already clear." As if in answer to his question, the space around the human fleet began to distort. Reality rippled like water, and Zethkar felt his instruments registering energy signatures that shouldn't exist. The humans had been quietly installing something while they fought, using their own ships as cover. "Quantum resonance field detected," announced Lieutenant Vex, his young voice cracking with disbelief. "They're creating a dimensional barrier?" Admiral Korvax's scales went pure white. "That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would drain a star. Unless, Dr. Minari said slowly, her harmonic voice trembling, "unless you use the quantum decay of matter itself as a power source." The horrible truth hit Zethkar like a physical blow. The humans weren't just fighting the Devourers. They were converting their own ships, their own bodies, their own quantum essence into fuel for a barrier that would seal this entire section of space. They were literally erasing themselves from existence to create a wall the Devourers couldn't cross. "The barrier will hold for approximately 50,000 years, came Admiral Chen's voice over the communication channel. She sounded tired now, older, as if the weight of what they were doing had finally settled on her shoulders. "Long enough for the galaxy to prepare proper defenses. The civilian ships are clear, and the navigation data for this region will be automatically corrupted in all databases within 48 hours. No one else will stumble into this trap." "Admiral," Korvax's voice was barely controlled, "you're talking about the complete annihilation of your fleet."
"Your people."
"Yes," Chen replied simply. "We are." The quantum distortions were growing stronger now, and Zethkar could see human ships beginning to fade at the edges, their matter converting to pure energy to feed the barrier. The crews weren't panicking, they weren't crying, they were working, calmly and methodically, ensuring the barrier would be perfect. Why? Dr. CCC. Minari asked, her musical voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" For the first time, Admiral Chen's composure cracked just slightly. Zethkar saw her hands tremble before she clasped them behind her back. When she spoke, her voice carried an emotion he couldn't identify, something deeper than fear, deeper than sorrow. "Because if we don't, if even one of these things escapes, they'll follow the civilian ships. They'll track down every refugee, every survivor, every child we just saved. And then they'll learn from us. They'll learn how we think, how we feel, how we love, and they'll use that knowledge to become something worse than anything the galaxy has ever seen." The transmission flickered as more of the human ship converted to energy. "We've seen it before in the outer colonies. What they do to captured populations. What they learn, what they become." Chen's voice was growing faint now, but her words carried clearly. "We won't let that happen to anyone else. Ever." "Admiral Chen," Korvax began, but she cut him off. "Tell the galaxy what you've seen here. Tell them that humans keep their promises. And tell them," her voice was fading now as her ship began its final conversion, "tell them that some prices are worth paying." The last thing Zethkar saw before the transmission ended was Admiral Chen's face. There was no fear there, no regret, no anger. There was only a quiet, terrible determination and something else. Something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Relief. The human fleet completed its conversion 12 minutes later. The quantum barrier snapped into place with a sound that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in the bones and souls of every observer. The Devourers threw themselves against it with mindless fury, but the barrier held. It would hold for 50,000 years, powered by the willing sacrifice of an entire human fleet. In the silence that followed, Admiral Korvax slowly turned to face his observation team. His scales had gone completely colorless, a sign of shock so profound that many Thrillians never recovered from it. "Did you record everything?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," Lieutenant Vex whispered. "Good. Copies to every world, every government, every species in the Coalition database. Mark it as Priority Alpha, full distribution." Dr. Minari's crystalline features were clouded with something that might have been tears, if her species could cry. "Admiral, what classification should we give this incident?" Korvax looked back at the barrier, its surface reflecting starlight like a mirror that stretched across space. Somewhere behind that barrier, the Devourers still raged, still hungered, still plotted. But they would never escape. The humans had made sure of that. "Classification?" Korvax repeated. "File it under things we owe them." As the Coalition fleet began its journey home, Zethkar remained at the observation deck, staring at the barrier. He had thought he understood humans from their reputation. Fierce fighters, loyal allies, stubborn to a fault. But now he realized he had understood nothing at all. Humans didn't fight like they were already dead. They fought like everyone else was already alive, and they were the only ones standing between life and the darkness. And that, Zethkar realized with growing unease, was only the beginning of what he would learn about the species that had just volunteered for extinction to save strangers they had never met. The fear he had seen in Admiral Chen's eyes hadn't been fear of dying. It had been fear of failing, fear that the barrier wouldn't hold. Fear that somewhere, somehow, the Devourers would find a way to reach the people they had sworn to protect. As the Coalition ships jumped to hyperspace, leaving the barrier behind, Zethkar made a note in his personal files. A single line that would change the course of his entire career. Human fear is not about what might happen to them. It is about what might happen to everyone else. He had no idea how right he was. 3 months after the barrier incident, Zethkar found himself assigned to the most unusual posting of his career. Cultural liaison aboard the human research vessel, Prometheus. The Coalition High Command wanted to understand their newest members better, and Zethkar's report on the Devourer engagement had marked him as the resident expert on human psychology. He wished he felt like one. The Prometheus was smaller than most Coalition vessels, built for long-range exploration rather than combat. Its corridors were narrow by galactic standards, designed for human proportions, and the artificial gravity felt strange under his four-legged gait. But what struck him most was the smell. Every species had its own scent signature, but humans carried something different. Not just their natural pheromones, but an undertone that his sensitive nose identified as chronic stress hormones mixed with something he couldn't name. "Commander Zethkar, welcome aboard," said Captain Maria Santos as she met him at the docking bay. She was younger than Admiral Chen had been, perhaps 40 standard years, with dark hair and eyes that held the same unsettling quality he had noticed in all humans. Alert, calculating, always watching for threats that others couldn't see. "Thank you, Captain Santos. I look forward to working with your crew." "Likewise. I understand you were at the barrier event?" Zethkar's four eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit he hadn't been able to break since childhood. "I was." "Your people's sacrifice was remarkable." Something flickered across Santos's face, gone so quickly that a less observant species might have missed it entirely. "They did what needed to be done. Come on, I'll show you to your quarters." We jumped to hyperspace in 6 hours. As they walked through the ship's corridors, Zethkar observed the crew with professional interest. Humans were remarkably diverse in appearance compared to most species, but their behavior patterns were strikingly consistent. They moved with purpose, even during routine tasks. They maintained constant awareness of their surroundings, and they all carried that same underlying tension, as if they were expecting bad news at any moment. "Captain, may I ask about our mission? Archaeological survey of the Kepler 442 system? The predecessors left some interesting ruins on the fourth planet. Nothing dangerous, just old technology that might teach us something useful. The predecessors were the galaxy's greatest mystery, an ancient civilization that had vanished millions of years ago, leaving behind only scattered ruins and technology so advanced that most of it remained incomprehensible. Archaeological missions to predecessor sites were considered prestigious assignments, low-risk opportunities to make significant discoveries. Zethkar's security training immediately made him suspicious. "Captain, forgive my directness, but I was expecting a more challenging assignment, given recent events." Santos stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Zethkar caught that flicker again, deeper this time. "Commander, has anyone explained to you why the Coalition is so interested in understanding human psychology? The official briefing mentioned cultural integration and diplomatic cooperation." "The official briefing was diplomatic nonsense," Santos said quietly. "The truth is, after the barrier event, a lot of very important people are asking the same question you probably are. What kind of species voluntarily commits mass suicide to save strangers? What drives that kind of behavior? And most importantly, what else are humans capable of?" She resumed walking, her pace slightly faster now. "Some of those important people think humans are too dangerous to be trusted with advanced technology. Others think we're too valuable as allies to lose. All of them want to understand what makes us tick." Zethkar's four stomachs clenched with unease. "And what do you think, Captain?" "I think," Santos said as they stopped outside his assigned quarters, "that they're asking the wrong questions." His quarters were Spartan but comfortable, with minor adjustments made for his physiology. As he settled in, Zethkar found himself reviewing everything he knew about humans. They had emerged from their homeworld less than 200 years ago, technologically primitive but advancing at an unprecedented rate. They had joined the coalition peacefully, contributing their expertise in combat psychology and defensive tactics. They had never started a war, never conquered another species, never even made territorial demands, but they had ended several conflicts that other species couldn't resolve. The Prometheus jumped to hyperspace on schedule, and Zethkar began his real work. His official duties involved cultural observation and reporting, but his true mission was to understand the psychology behind the barrier event. The Coalition wanted to know if humans could be predicted, controlled, or at least understood well enough to prevent future surprises. Dr. James Wright, the mission's lead archaeologist, proved to be an unexpected source of insight. Unlike the military personnel, Wright seemed genuinely relaxed, eager to discuss his work and his species' history. Over dinner in the ship's small mess hall, Zethkar found himself drawn into conversations that revealed more than any formal interview could have. "The thing people don't understand about humans," Wright said one evening as they shared a meal of synthesized proteins, "is that we're natural catastrophe planners. It's built into our evolutionary psychology." Catastrophe planning? Zethkar's translator struggled with the human idiom. We assume the worst-case scenario and prepare for it. Always. It's why we developed agriculture, why we built cities, why we reached for the stars. We're constantly asking, what if everything goes wrong? Wright gestured with his fork, accidentally flinging a piece of synthetic chicken across the table. Your homeworld has had the same climate for millions of years. The Thrillian home system has been geologically quiet since before multicellular life evolved. But Earth? Earth tried to kill us every few thousand years like clockwork. Zethkar thought about the ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and mass extinctions he had read about in human history files. So you developed paranoia as a survival trait. Not paranoia. Preparedness. We learned to plan for disasters we couldn't imagine, to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term survival. And we learned something else too. Wright's expression grew serious, taking on that quality Zethkar had noticed in all humans. We learned that sometimes the only way to save the group is to lose the individual. The barrier event. The barrier event. Admiral Chen's fleet didn't make that decision in a moment of panic. They had drilled for that exact scenario dozens of times. Every human military unit has protocols for total sacrifice if it becomes necessary to prevent a larger catastrophe. Zethkar felt his skin prickle with unease. You mean humans plan to die? Wright laughed, but there was no humor in it. We plan for everything, Commander, including scenarios where dying is the optimal solution. 3 days into the mission, they reached the Kepler 442 system and began their survey of the fourth planet. The predecessor ruins were extensive, covering several continents with structures that defied conventional physics. Wright and his team worked with quiet efficiency, cataloging artifacts and recording dimensional readings with equipment that barely functioned near predecessor technology. Zethkar observed them carefully, noting the way humans approached the unknown. Other species tended toward either extreme caution or reckless curiosity when dealing with predecessor sites. Humans displayed neither. They were methodical, thorough, and deeply suspicious of everything they found. "Why are you so careful?" Zethkar asked, right as they examined a crystalline structure that hummed with residual energy. "Because predecessor ruins have a history of containing unpleasant surprises. Dead man switches, automated defense systems, dimensional traps. We've lost 3 survey teams to booby traps in the last 50 years. But that was before you developed proper safety protocols." Wright gave him a look that made Zethkar's environmental suit feel suddenly inadequate. "Commander, there's something about humans you need to understand. We don't believe in proper safety protocols. We believe in redundant safety protocols, backup safety protocols, and emergency protocols for when the safety protocols fail." As if summoned by his words, alarms began blaring throughout the survey site. Zethkar's enhanced hearing immediately identified the specific pattern. Containment breach, biological hazard, immediate evacuation required. The human response was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. There was no panic, no shouting, no rushing. Instead, the survey team moved with practiced precision, each member executing predetermined tasks without needing orders. Equipment was secured, samples were protected, and evacuation routes were cleared with mechanical efficiency. "Commander Zethkar, please proceed to evacuation point Alpha," Wright called out, his voice calm despite the growing urgency of the alarms. "What about your team?" We'll be along. Standard protocol requires a full containment sweep before evacuation. Zethkar watched in amazement as the humans continued their work, even as something toxic leaked from the damaged predecessor structure. They weren't ignoring the danger. They were working around it, adapting their procedures to maintain mission effectiveness while minimizing risk. Captain Santos appeared at his side, her face covered by an emergency breathing mask. Commander, we need to move. Now. What about Dr. Wright's team? They'll follow protocol. Her tone suggested the discussion was over. As they reached the evacuation point, Zethkar looked back to see the human survey team still working, still calm, still methodically completing their tasks, despite the growing environmental hazard. They weren't being reckless. They were being human. The evacuation shuttle lifted off 12 minutes later, carrying all personnel and most of the equipment. As they broke atmosphere, Zethkar reviewed the sensor logs and felt his four stomachs clench with realization. The containment breach had been deliberate, triggered by a predecessor security system that had remained dormant for millions of years. They knew, he whispered. Excuse me? Captain Santos asked. Your people knew there might be active defenses. You prepared for this exact scenario. Santos nodded. Standard predecessor site protocol includes provisions for automated defense activation, dimensional instability, temporal displacement, and approximately 47 other potential hazards. But how? How do you plan for the unknown? By assuming it's not unknown, Santos replied. By assuming that somewhere, sometime, someone has encountered it before and died learning about it. And by making sure their deaths teach us something useful. Back aboard the Prometheus, Zethkar found himself in Dr. Wright's laboratory, watching the archaeologists analyze samples they had extracted from the site. Despite the evacuation, despite the danger, despite the loss of half their planned survey time, Wright seemed almost pleased with the results. Fascinating, Wright murmured, studying a piece of crystalline material through a quantum microscope. The security system wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to test us. Test us for what? Wright looked up, and Zethkar saw that expression again, the one that had haunted him since the barrier event. Not fear, not paranoia, but a deep, abiding awareness of dangerous possibilities. I don't know, Wright said quietly. But whatever it was testing for, I think we passed. That night, alone in his quarters, Zethkar reviewed his observations and felt a growing certainty that he was missing something fundamental about human nature. The barrier event hadn't been an aberration. The evacuation protocols weren't just careful planning. There was something deeper at work. Something that connected the way humans approached archaeology to the way they approached warfare. He activated his personal recording device and began his daily report to Coalition Command, but halfway through his standard observations he stopped and started over. Personal log Zethkar investigating. I am beginning to suspect that human behavior patterns are not driven by fear of death or desire for glory as previously theorized. Instead, they appear to be driven by fear of inadequacy, fear of failing to protect others, fear of being unprepared when catastrophe strikes. This may explain their tendency toward overplanning, redundant safety measures, and willingness to accept personal sacrifice for group benefit. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Recommendation. Future human integration protocols should account for the possibility that humans view themselves not as individuals seeking survival, but as guardians responsible for protecting others from threats they may not even be able to imagine. This fundamental difference in self-perception may be the key to understanding all observed human behavior patterns. As he sealed the report for transmission, Zethkar realized that his mission was just beginning. If he was right about human psychology, then the barrier event wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time the galaxy had been watching when humans did what they always did. Plan for the worst, hope for the best, and pay any price necessary to protect everyone else from the darkness they could see coming. The question that kept him awake that night was simple. What darkness were they preparing for now? 6 weeks after the predecessor site incident, Zethkar thought he was beginning to understand humans. That was the second mistake. The breakthrough came during a routine analysis of the crystalline samples Dr. Wright had recovered. Zethkar was observing the human research team when the quantum resonance scanner began displaying patterns that shouldn't exist. The crystal wasn't just storing information. It was actively communicating, responding to their presence with complex mathematical sequences that grew more sophisticated by the hour. It's trying to establish a dialogue, Doctor said. Wright announced, his voice tight with excitement and something else that Zethkar was learning to recognize as deeply buried fear. The patterns are definitely intentional. Structured, intelligent. Captain Santos joined them in the laboratory, her expression neutral but her posture betraying the same tension that seemed to live in all humans like a second skeleton. "Doctor, are you telling me this rock is talking to us?" "Not exactly talking. More like testing our mathematical comprehension. It's presenting increasingly complex problems and waiting for us to solve them before moving to the next level." Zefkar studied the holographic display showing the crystal's output. The mathematical progression was indeed elegant, starting with basic arithmetic and advancing through geometry, calculus, and into theoretical frameworks that push the boundaries of current galactic knowledge. "What happens if we solve all the problems?" Wright and Santos exchanged a look that made Zefkar's four stomachs clench. It was the same expression he had seen on Admiral Chen's face just before the barrier event. The look of people who knew something terrible was coming and were preparing to face it anyway. "That's what worries me," Santos said quietly. The human approach to the Predator communication device was unlike anything Zefkar had observed in other species. When the Altarians had discovered a similar artifact 15 years ago, they had rushed to solve its puzzles, eager to gain access to advanced knowledge. The Thrillians had approached such discoveries with ceremonial reverence, treating them as religious relics to be studied slowly and carefully. The Vrex had typically tried to reverse engineer the technology for military applications. Humans did all of those things simultaneously, but with multiple layers of contingency planning that bordered on the paranoid. Dr. Jamison Wright's team solved the mathematical problems with brilliant efficiency, while Captain Santos quietly implemented security protocols that assumed the worst possible outcomes. Emergency evacuations plans were updated hourly. The ship's weapon systems were discreetly charged and targeted at their own location. Quantum isolation fields were installed around the laboratory with independent power sources and deadman switches. Captain Zefkar asked during one of their evening briefings, "Why are you preparing to destroy your own ship?" "Because," Santos replied matter-of-factly, "if this goes wrong, the consequences could extend far beyond just us. The predecessors didn't leave booby traps for entertainment. They left warnings." "Warnings about what?" "That's what we're hoping not to find out." The mathematical dialogue continued for 3 days, growing more complex and more urgent. The crystal's patterns began incorporating temporal mathematics, dimensional theory, and quantum frameworks that existed only in the most advanced theoretical research. Wright's team worked in rotating shifts, their excitement gradually giving way to something approaching dread. On the 4th day, they solved the final equation. The crystal's response was immediate and terrifying. The laboratory filled with holographic images, three-dimensional maps of galactic space showing star systems, trade routes, and population centers with perfect accuracy. But overlaid on this familiar map was something else, something that made every human in the room go very quiet and very still. Invasion routes. Calculated with mathematical precision, showing optimal approaches to every major world in the galaxy. Fleet compositions designed to counter specific species' defensive capabilities. Psychological warfare protocols tailored to exploit the weaknesses of different alien minds. And at the center of it all, a countdown timer marking approximately 374 standard years. "Ooh," Dr. Wright whispered, his face pale beneath the holographic projections. "Oh no." Zefkar stared at the display, his translator struggling to process what he was seeing. "This is invasion plan? The predecessors were planning to invade the galaxy?" "Not the predecessors," Captain Santos said, her voice deadly calm as she activated the ship's emergency protocols with practiced efficiency. "Someone else. Something else. The predecessors were trying to warn us." The holographic display shifted, showing new images that made Zefkar's skin crawl despite his environmental suit. Ships unlike anything in the galactic databases, built from materials that bent light in impossible ways. Weapon systems that didn't just destroy matter but erased it from existence entirely. And worst of all, creatures that looked almost familiar, almost recognizable, until you realized they were wearing the faces of the species they had conquered. "The predecessors fought them," Wright said, studying the tactical data with the same intense focus he brought to archaeological analysis. "These projections show battle sites, defensive positions, last stands." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The predecessors lost." Captain Santos was already implementing evacuation procedures, her movements sharp and efficient. "Right, how much of this data can we preserve?" "All of it. The crystal is downloading everything into our quantum storage matrix. Battle plans, technological specifications, psychological profiles." He looked up from his instruments, his face grave. Captain, this is intelligence about an enemy that defeated the most advanced civilization in galactic history. And according to this timeline, they're coming back. Then we need to get this information to Coalition Command immediately. No, Wright said, and his tone made everyone in the laboratory stop what they were doing. We need to get this information to Earth. Zethkar felt his 4 hearts skip in sequence. Dr. Wright, the Coalition has far superior analysis capabilities. The Coalition has superior technology, Wright interrupted, but they don't have what we need for this. He gestured at the holographic invasion plans. Look at these strategies. This enemy doesn't just defeat civilizations. They study them first. They learn how we think, how we fight, how we fear. Then they use that knowledge to become something perfectly designed to destroy us. Santos nodded grimly. Standard Coalition response would be to form committees, conduct studies, build better defenses, all logical responses that this enemy has already planned for. So what makes you think humans can do better? Zethkar asked. Wright and Santos exchanged another of those looks, and Zethkar realized he was about to learn something that would change his understanding of humans forever. Because, Santos said quietly, humans don't fight fair. The Prometheus jumped to hyperspace 6 hours later, carrying what might be the most important intelligence discovery in galactic history. But instead of heading for Coalition Command at Alpha Centauri, they set course for Sol System, for Earth itself. During the journey, Zethkar observed the human crew with new eyes. The revelation about the returning enemy had changed them, but not in ways he expected. They weren't panicking or despairing. Instead, they displayed a focused intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of the barrier event. They were already planning, already preparing for a war that wouldn't begin for nearly 4 centuries. Dr. Cupboard. Right, Zethkar said, one evening as they shared another synthetic meal. May I ask what makes you think humans can succeed where the predecessors failed? Wright considered his answer carefully, stabbing thoughtfully at his protein substitute. The predecessors were like most galactic civilizations. Advanced, logical, unified in their thinking. When they encountered this enemy, they probably tried to understand them, to find diplomatic solutions, to apply their superior technology in conventional ways. And humans would do differently? Humans would do everything differently. Wright set down his fork and leaned forward. We're not logical. We're not unified. We don't fight fair, we don't think conventionally, and we absolutely do not believe in superior technology as a guarantee of victory. He gestured toward the holographic display still showing invasion routes. This enemy studies their targets and adapts accordingly. But what happens when you study humans? What happens when you try to understand a species that regularly does things that make no strategic sense? Zethkar thought about the barrier event, about Admiral Chen's fleet converting themselves to energy rather than retreating to fight another day. They would have difficulty predicting human responses. And more than that, they would have difficulty preparing for a species that doesn't just adapt to threats but actively seeks them out. Wright's expression took on that quality again, the one that made Zethkar's skin crawl. Humans don't wait for problems to find them. We go looking for them. Is that what you're doing now? Looking for problems? No, Wright said quietly. We're looking for solutions. The kind of solutions that make other species uncomfortable. 3 days from Earth, Captain Santos called Zethkar to her ready room for what she termed a clarification briefing. The small space was dominated by tactical displays showing Earth's defensive networks, but Zethkar noticed that many of the installations weren't on any Coalition database. Commander Santos began without preamble. I need to explain something about human military doctrine that wasn't covered in your briefing materials. I'm listening, Captain. The Coalition knows about our defensive fleets, our research facilities, our standard military installations. What they don't know about is what we call the deep programs. Santos activated a holographic display showing Earth's solar system, but with additional markers that Zethkar had never seen before, hidden installations throughout the asteroid belt, research stations in the outer system. And something that made his 4 stomachs clench with unease, weapon platforms positioned at gravitational balance points that would be invisible to most scanning methods. These installations have been operational since we joined the Coalition. They represent our real defensive capability, and more importantly, our real research into unconventional warfare. Unconventional warfare? Weapons and tactics that violate galactic conventions on ethical combat? Psychological warfare systems that could drive entire species to madness? Biological agents designed to target specific genetic markers? Temporal displacement weapons that could erase enemy fleets from history itself? Zethkar felt his environmental suit's temperature regulation struggling to compensate for his rising stress levels. Captain, such weapons would be considered crimes against sapient life under Coalition law, which is why the Coalition doesn't know about them, and why we've never used them. Santos's expression was grave, almost apologetic. But we've built them, tested them, and prepared deployment strategies. Because someday we might face an enemy that leaves us no choice. The returning enemy, among others. Santos deactivated the display and fixed Zethkar with a steady stare. Commander, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. After what you've seen, after what you've learned about humans, do you trust us? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Zethkar thought about Admiral Chen's sacrifice, about the survey team's methodical evacuation procedures, about Dr. Wright's careful analysis of incomprehensible data. He thought about species that planned for every disaster they could imagine, that built weapons they hoped never to use, that sacrificed themselves to save strangers. I trust you to do what you believe is necessary to protect innocent life, he said finally. Santos nodded. That's all we've ever asked for. Earth orbit was unlike anything Zethkar had expected. The visible installations matched Coalition databases, defensive platforms, research stations, commercial facilities, but his enhanced senses detected gravitational anomalies, power signatures that didn't match their supposed sources, and communication traffic in frequencies that weren't supposed to exist. The humans had been busy. Dr. Wright's data package was transmitted to Earth's Deep Research Division within minutes of their arrival. The response came back 6 hours later in the form of a priority message from someone identified only as the Planner. The message was brief. Analysis confirms threat assessment. Deep Program 7 is now active. Recommend full Coalition briefing within 72 hours. Time remaining. Insufficient for conventional preparation. Captain Santos read the message twice, then looked up at Zethkar with an expression he had never seen on a human face before. Not fear, not determination, but something that might have been relief mixed with profound sadness. What's Deep Program 7? Zethkar asked. Something we hoped we'd never need, Santos replied, and something that's going to change the galaxy forever. As the Prometheus docked with Earth's primary orbital station, Zethkar realized that his mission to understand human psychology was about to enter a phase he hadn't planned for. He was going to see what humans did when they stopped preparing for the worst-case scenario and started implementing it. The thought that kept him awake during his last night aboard the Prometheus was disturbingly simple. If the humans were this prepared for an enemy that wouldn't arrive for centuries, what other threats were they already planning for? And more importantly, what had they already seen that the rest of the galaxy hadn't? The Deep Research Division existed in a place that officially wasn't there. Zethkar's transport shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere toward coordinates that showed as empty ocean on every public chart. His pilot, a taciturn human named Rodriguez, offered no explanation for their destination until the ocean itself began to part, revealing a massive installation that rose from the seafloor like a metallic island. "Welcome to Deep 7, Rodriguez said, his voice carefully neutral. "Try not to think too hard about what you see down there. Most of it violates several laws of physics." The facility was impossible. Not just large, which it certainly was, but impossible in ways that made Zethkar's enhanced vision struggle to process the architecture. Corridors that were longer inside than outside. Laboratories that existed in folded space, somehow containing volumes greater than the buildings that housed them. And everywhere, the quiet efficiency of humans working on projects that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Chowan. Elena Vasquez met them at the docking bay. She was older than most humans Zethkar had encountered, perhaps 60 standard years, with silver hair and the kind of calm intensity that suggested decades of dealing with impossible problems. Her title, according to the brief introduction Rodriguez provided, was simply the Planner. "Commander Zethkar," she said, extending a hand in the human greeting gesture. "Dr. Wright's data package has been very illuminating. I understand you've been studying human psychology?" "Yes, Dr. Vasquez. Though I'm beginning to suspect I've only scratched the surface. You have no idea." Her smile was neither warm nor cold, just professionally polite. "Come with me. There are some things you need to see before we brief the Coalition." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch and contract based on some internal logic Zethkar couldn't fathom. Human researchers moved past them, carrying equipment he couldn't identify, working on projects that his translator couldn't even properly parse. The conversations he overheard contained technical terms that didn't exist in any database. "Dr. Vasquez," Zethkar said carefully, "how long have these deep programs been operational? The first one was established 17 years ago, shortly after we joined the Coalition." We'd been members for about 6 months when our xenopsychology teams completed their analysis of galactic civilization patterns. And what did that analysis conclude? Vasquez stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Her expression was that now familiar human look of someone preparing to deliver unpleasant news. That every major galactic civilization follows the same pattern. They develop, they prosper, they achieve technological advancement, and then they encounter something that destroys them utterly. The predecessors were just the most recent example. She resumed walking, leading him deeper into the facility. We realized that joining the coalition meant inheriting all of their enemies, known and unknown. So we began preparing for threats that didn't exist yet. The Deep Programs. The Deep Programs, 7 major research initiatives, each one focused on a different category of civilization-ending threat. Some conventional, some exotic, some that exist only in theoretical frameworks. Vasquez's voice carried that undertone Zethkar was learning to associate with human fear. Not fear of dying, but fear of inadequacy. We hoped we were being paranoid. They entered a vast laboratory space that defied spatial logic. The room seemed to curve inward on itself while simultaneously extending to impossible distances. Workstations were arranged in patterns that followed non-Euclidean geometry, connected by walkways that crossed dimensional boundaries with casual efficiency. "This is Deep Program 7, Vasquez announced. "Preparation for contact with aggressively adaptive hostile entities." The holographic displays throughout the laboratory showed familiar images. The invasion routes from Dr. Wright's crystal, but enhanced with additional data that made Zethkar's skin crawl. Detailed analysis of enemy adaptation patterns. Psychological profiles of conquered species, and most disturbing of all, computer simulations showing how the returning enemy would modify their tactics based on current galactic defenses. "They learn," Wright said, appearing at Zethkar's side with a data tablet in his hands. "That's their primary advantage. They study each civilization they encounter, absorb their knowledge, and adapt their approach accordingly. By the time they reach us, they'll have centuries of accumulated tactical intelligence from dozens of conquered worlds." "So how do you fight an enemy that learns?" Zethkar asked. "You don't," Vasquez replied. "You make learning irrelevant." She led them to a central display that showed a 3-dimensional model of something that hurt Zethkar's eyes to look at directly. The structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its surfaces reflecting realities that didn't match their surroundings. "This is the Pandora Array," Vasquez explained, "a weapon system designed not to destroy the enemy, but to make them impossible to predict or prepare for." Zethkar studied the impossible structure, his translator struggling with the technical specifications scrolling past on nearby displays. "I don't understand. How does a weapon make enemies unpredictable?" "By making reality unpredictable," Wright said quietly. "The array doesn't fire projectiles or energy beams. It fires controlled chaos. Probability storms that make cause and effect operate according to new rules. In the affected area, the enemy's accumulated knowledge becomes useless because the fundamental laws of physics become fluid." "That's," Zethkar paused, searching for appropriate words, "that's terrifying." "Yes," Vasquez agreed. "It is, which is why it's one of our more moderate options." She activated another display showing schematics that made the Pandora Array look simple by comparison. Zethkar saw weapon designs that incorporated temporal mechanics, systems that could retroactively prevent enemy fleets from ever existing, and devices that weaponized abstract concepts like hope and despair. "Dr. Vasquez, these technologies, they could unmake entire star systems, entire galaxies if we calibrated them wrong." Her voice was matter-of-fact, professional, terrifying in its casualness, which is why we've spent the last 17 years not just building them, but building safeguards to ensure they're never used unless absolutely necessary. They walked past laboratories where human scientists worked on projects that defied rational understanding. In one room, researchers were constructing ammunition made from compressed time. In another, engineers tested communication devices that transmitted messages to the past. And in a sealed chamber that made Zethkar's sensors scream warnings about dimensional instability, the team was apparently having a calm conversation with something that existed only in mathematical theory. "The beauty of human psychology," Wright said, noticing Zethkar's horrified fascination, "is that we can conceptualize these weapons without wanting to use them. Most species would either refuse to build such things on moral grounds, or would build them and immediately want to test their effectiveness. But humans build them and then file them away for emergencies," Vasquez added. "It's the same instinct that drives us to prepare for natural disasters we hope will never happen." They entered a briefing room where several other humans were waiting. Zethkar recognized Captain Santos, but the others were new. Military officers, scientists, and individuals whose roles weren't immediately obvious. All of them shared that familiar expression of people who carried terrible knowledge with professional calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vasquez announced, "Commander Zethkar has been observing human behavior patterns for the Coalition High Command. I believe it's time we gave him something substantial to report." Admiral Sarah Harrison, a stern-faced woman with strategic implants that interfaced directly with her nervous system, activated a holographic display that filled the room with tactical projections. "Commander, what you're about to see is classified at the highest levels of human government. The Coalition believes our military capabilities consist of approximately 47 defensive fleets and standard-yield weapons platforms." The display showed Earth's actual defensive network, thousands of installations throughout Sol system, weapon platforms that could sterilize entire star sectors, and fleet compositions that dwarfed anything the Coalition imagined humans possessed. "Our real strength," Harrison continued, "is approximately 400 times what we've reported to Coalition Command." Zethkar felt his four hearts skip in unison. "Admiral, why hide such capabilities?" "Because, Dr. Bashka," Vasquez said quietly, "other species are afraid of us already." "Can you imagine their reaction if they knew we could casually destroy any fleet in the galaxy?" "But more importantly," Wright added, "we needed time to build things the galaxy isn't ready to know about." The holographic display shifted to show new schematics, weapons that incorporated technologies Zethkar had never seen before. Devices that seemed to bend space-time around themselves, installations that drew power from sources that shouldn't exist, and ships that moved through dimensions that weren't supposed to be accessible to three-dimensional beings. 17 years ago, Vasquez explained, our analysis indicated that the galaxy was facing an extinction-level threat within the next few centuries, not just the returning enemy, though they're certainly part of it. We identified at least 12 distinct categories of civilization-ending dangers that the Coalition isn't prepared to handle. She gestured to the weapons displays. "So we prepared to handle them ourselves." Captain Santos leaned forward. "Commander, I need you to understand something crucial about human military doctrine. We don't build weapons to fight wars. We build weapons to end them. Definitively, with minimal casualties to friendly forces. And maximum deterrent effect," Admiral Harrison added. "The goal isn't to be stronger than every possible enemy. The goal is to be so overwhelmingly superior that potential enemies choose not to fight at all." Zethkar studied the impossible weapons, the reality-bending technologies, the casual discussion of forces that could reshape the galaxy itself, and if they choose to fight anyway. The humans in the room exchanged glances, and Zethkar saw something that chilled him more than any weapon display. Absolute certainty. "Then we make sure," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, "that they never get the chance to threaten anyone else." The briefing continued for 6 hours, covering weapon systems that violated known physics, defensive networks that could survive the destruction of entire solar systems, and contingency plans for threats that existed only in theoretical frameworks. Through it all, the humans maintained that same professional calm, discussing civilization-ending capabilities with the same tone they might use to debate lunch options. But Zethkar noticed something else in their behavior, something that connected this moment to everything he had observed since the barrier event. The humans weren't proud of their weapons. They weren't excited about their overwhelming technological superiority. They were afraid. Not afraid of dying, not afraid of losing, but afraid of what they might have to become to protect everyone else. "Dr. Vasquez," he said finally, "what happens if the Coalition refuses to accept these weapons? What if they demand you disarm?" She considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful. "Then we would face a difficult choice. Reveal the full scope of the threats we've identified and risk causing galaxy-wide panic, or continue protecting the Coalition without their knowledge or consent." "And which would you choose?" "The same choice we've always made," she replied. "Whatever keeps the greatest number of people alive." As the briefing concluded, Zethkar found himself facing a truth that would reshape everything he thought he knew about humans. They hadn't been preparing for war for 17 years. They had been preparing for the responsibility of protecting a galaxy that couldn't protect itself. The weapons, the technologies, the impossible capabilities, all of it was designed not for conquest, but for guardianship. The humans had looked at the galaxy's history of repeated extinctions and made a simple decision. Not again. Not on their watch. But the weight of that responsibility, the burden of carrying weapons that could unmake reality itself, was visible in every human face he encountered. They carried the power to reshape the galaxy, and they were terrified of what that power might cost them. As Zethkar prepared for the Coalition briefing that would change galactic politics forever, he realized he finally understood what he had seen in Admiral Chen's eyes during the barrier event. It wasn't fear of failing to save people. It was fear of succeeding and having to live with what success required. The Coalition Emergency Assembly convened 48 hours after Zethkar's return from Earth, and the galaxy would never be the same. Representatives from 37 species gathered in the great amphitheater of Coalition Central, their varied forms filling seats designed to accommodate the incredible diversity of galactic civilization. Zethkar sat in the observer section, watching as Dr. Vasquez, Admiral Harrison, and Dr. Wright took their positions at the central podium. They moved with that familiar human efficiency, but underneath their professional composure, he could see the weight of what they were about to reveal. Admiral Korvax called the assembly to order, his midnight blue scales rippling with nervous energy. We have gathered an emergency session to hear testimony regarding a potential threat to galactic security. Dr. Helena Vasquez of the Human Deep Research Division has requested to address this body with information of the highest classification level. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The Altarian delegation's crystalline features chimed with harmonic concern. The Vrex representatives huddled together, their peaceful nature making them visibly uncomfortable with talk of threats and weapons. The Thrillian military attachés displayed the scale darkening that indicated deep unease. Vasquez stepped forward, her calm demeanor unchanged despite facing the most powerful gathering in galactic history. Honored delegates, 17 years ago, humanity joined the Coalition with the understanding that we would contribute to mutual defense and peaceful cooperation. Today I must inform you that the nature of that defense has evolved beyond what we initially reported. She activated the holographic display system, filling the amphitheater with familiar images: the predecessor ruins, the crystal communication device, the invasion routes that painted a horrifying picture of galactic vulnerability. 14 days ago, a joint human coalition archaeological mission discovered evidence of an imminent threat to all sentient life in this galaxy. An enemy that destroyed the predecessors will return in approximately 370 years, armed with knowledge and capabilities drawn from centuries of conquest. The assembly erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted in dozens of languages, their universal translators struggling to keep pace with the cacophony of fear, disbelief, and outrage. Representative Dylas of the Zephyrian Trade Federation stood, his gossamer wings vibrating with agitation. This is impossible. The predecessors vanished millions of years ago. Their fate has no bearing on current galactic security. The predecessors vanished. Dr. Wright interjected, rising from his seat with a data tablet that projected supporting evidence, because they were systematically exterminated by an enemy that studies its targets, adapts to their defenses, and then returns to finish what it started. Our analysis indicates this enemy has been conducting a methodical campaign of galactic conquest for approximately 4 million years. The chaos intensified. Delegate after delegate rose to voice objections, demand proof, or simply express their horror at the implications. Through it all, the human representatives waited with patient calm, allowing the storm of emotion to exhaust itself before continuing. It was Dr. Bad, Minari of the Altarian Science Collective, who finally restored order, her harmonic voice cutting through the noise with crystalline clarity. If this threat is real, if these projections are accurate, then we must ask the obvious question: what can be done? How does the Coalition prepare for an enemy that defeated the most advanced civilization in galactic history? Admiral Harrison stepped forward, and Zethkar felt his 4 stomachs clench with anticipation. This was the moment everything changed. Honored delegates, Harrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making impossible decisions. Humanity has been preparing for this threat and others like it since we joined the Coalition. What you are about to see represents our species' contribution to galactic defense. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly the amphitheater was filled with images of weapons that defied comprehension. The Pandora array materialized in impossible detail, its reality-bending architecture visible from every angle. Weapon platforms that drew power from collapsed stars, ships that moved through folded space-time, defense networks that could survive the destruction of entire solar systems. The silence that followed was absolute. Delegate Corvus of the Thrillian Defense Council was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. These weapons, they could destroy entire star sectors. Entire galaxies, Admiral Harrison confirmed, if necessary. Impossible, breathed Representative Vex of the Saurian Engineering Guild. The energy requirements alone would require the output of multiple stars, Doctor. Vasquez nodded. which is why we built the stellar conversion arrays 17 years ago. Each installation can convert a star's entire mass to usable energy within approximately 6 hours. The assembly descended into chaos again, but this time the emotion was different. Not just fear, but a dawning understanding of what the humans had been quietly building while the rest of the galaxy focused on trade agreements and territorial disputes. "You've been hiding this from us," accused Prime Minister Zelen of the Vrex Pacifist Coalition, her naturally peaceful demeanor cracking under the strain of the revelation. "These weapons, these capabilities, you could have conquered the entire galaxy." "Yes," Dr. Vasquez replied simply. "We could have." "Then why didn't you?" demanded Admiral Korvax, his scales shifting through colors that indicated profound confusion. Captain Santos rose from her seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quality Zethkar had heard from Admiral Chen during the barrier event. The sound of someone explaining a truth so fundamental that questioning it seemed absurd. Because conquest was never the objective, protection was. She gestured to the weapon displays that still filled the amphitheater. "Every system you see here was designed with a single purpose, ensuring that threats to galactic civilization are eliminated before they can cause harm to innocent populations. We built these weapons not to rule the galaxy, but to guard it. From an enemy that won't arrive for centuries?" challenged Representative Thylus. "From enemies that arrive every day," Admiral Harrison replied, activating new displays that showed threats Zethkar hadn't known existed. Rogue AI networks spreading through subspace. Dimensional parasites that fed on civilized worlds. Temporal anomalies that could erase entire species from history. The returning enemy is just the largest threat on a very long list. Dr. Wright stepped forward, his archaeological training evident in the way he presented evidence. "Delegates, our analysis of galactic history shows a pattern of cyclical extinction events. Every 50 to 70,000 years, something emerges to threaten all sentient life. The predecessors were just the most recent victims." "And you've appointed yourselves as our protectors?" asked Dr. Minari, her harmonic voice carrying undertones of both gratitude and concern. "We've volunteered," Dr. Vasquez corrected. "The same way Admiral Chen's fleet volunteered at the barrier event. Because someone needs to stand between the galaxy and the darkness, and we're willing to pay that price." Zethkar felt something click into place in his understanding. The fear he had seen in human eyes. The constant preparation for disasters that might never come, the willingness to sacrifice themselves for strangers. It all stemmed from a simple recognition that someone had to take responsibility for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "The burden of carrying these weapons," Dr. Vasquez continued, "the responsibility of making decisions that could affect trillions of lives, the knowledge of threats that would cause panic if widely known, we've carried all of this for 17 years. Not because we wanted to, but because it was necessary." She deactivated the weapon displays, returning the amphitheater to its normal state. "Today, we're offering to share that burden, to work with the Coalition to prepare defenses against threats that exist beyond conventional understanding. But we need your trust, and your acceptance that sometimes protection requires capabilities that seem frightening." The debate that followed lasted 18 hours, with delegates arguing, questioning, and demanding additional proof. But gradually a consensus emerged. The galaxy faced threats that conventional thinking couldn't address. Humanity had developed solutions that conventional morality struggled to accept, and the alternative to accepting human guardianship was accepting the eventual extinction of galactic civilization. The final vote was unanimous, though many delegates clearly struggled with their decision. The Coalition formally recognized humanity's deep programs as legitimate defensive initiatives and granted authorization for expanded development of unconventional weapons systems. But it was the private conversation afterward that revealed the true cost of what had transpired. Zethkar found Dr. Vasquez in a quiet observation deck overlooking Coalition Central's diplomatic gardens. She stood alone, staring out at the carefully maintained ecosystem that represented the best of galactic cooperation, her expression unreadable. "Doctor," Zethkar began carefully, "the Assembly accepted your proposals. The galaxy now has protection against threats it couldn't even imagine. You should be pleased." Vasquez turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the same expression that had haunted him since the barrier event. Not fear of failure, but fear of success and what it required. "Commander, do you know what the worst part of today was? Not the weapons reveal, not the political maneuvering, not even the burden of explaining technologies that violate basic physics. What then? The relief I saw on their faces when they realized they didn't have to carry this responsibility themselves. The gratitude for being protected, combined with the willingness to let someone else make the hard choices. She looked back at the gardens, where representatives from dozens of species mingled in peaceful cooperation. They're happy to let humans be the monsters so they can remain innocent. Zethkar felt his understanding of human psychology take its final terrible shape. You're not protecting the galaxy from external threats. You're protecting the galaxy from having to become what you've become. We're protecting them from having to know what we know, Vasquez corrected. From seeing what we've seen? From making the choices we've made? Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The greatest fear humans carry isn't dying for others. It's living with what we've had to do to keep them safe. She activated a small holographic display that showed Earth's current defensive status. Weapon systems capable of remaking reality stood ready for deployment. Soldiers trained to wage war across multiple dimensions maintained constant vigilance. Scientists worked on projects that could save or damn the galaxy with equal efficiency. Every day, millions of humans wake up knowing they carry the power to destroy everything they've sworn to protect. Every day, they choose not to use that power. And every day, they prepare for the possibility that tomorrow they might not have a choice. Zethkar finally understood what he had been seeing all along. The fear in human eyes wasn't about inadequacy or failure. It was about adequacy and success. About having the power to solve any problem and the wisdom to understand what that power cost. The returning enemy, he said quietly. When they arrive, they'll face humans who have had centuries to prepare. They'll encounter weapons that shouldn't exist, tactics that defy logic, and a species that fights wars in ways that can't be predicted or countered. Yes, Vasquez agreed, and they'll discover what the predecessors never understood. The most dangerous species in the galaxy isn't the one with the best technology or the strongest military. It's the one willing to become monsters so everyone else can remain human. As Zethkar prepared his final report for Coalition Command, he realized that his mission to understand human psychology had revealed a truth more profound than anyone had anticipated. Humans weren't just another species joining the galactic community. They were the species that would guard that community, regardless of what it cost them. The fear he had witnessed, the terror that lurked behind every human smile, wasn't about what might happen to them. It was about what might happen to everyone else if they failed in their self-appointed role as guardians of galactic innocence. In his final log entry, Zethkar wrote, "Human beings carry a burden that no other species has voluntarily accepted. They have made themselves responsible for protecting the galaxy from threats it cannot imagine, using methods it cannot accept, while maintaining the very civilization they risk corrupting through their guardianship. They are willing to be feared, mistrusted, and morally compromised so that others can live in peace and safety." He paused, considering his next words carefully. The greatest service we can provide to humanity is to never fully understand the price they pay for our protection. The greatest tragedy is that they would never ask us to share that burden, even if it destroys them. Standing with humans, Zethkar had witnessed a fear like no other. Not the fear of death or defeat, but the fear of becoming something terrible in service to something good. And he had learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is accepting the responsibility to be the monster so others don't have to. The galaxy was safe. The humans would see to that, even if it killed them. Especially if it killed them, that was what made them human.